When I was 10 years old, a friend and I rode our bicycles from our homes, our neighborhood, to Cobb Center Mall in Marietta, Georgia. And in that shopping center was a drugstore, Dunaway Drugs. In that drugstore, there was a restaurant. Can you imagine walking into a Walgreens or a CVS and there being a restaurant? Well, they used to put restaurants in drugstores. And we walked into this restaurant inside of this drugstore, and there was a man sitting at the counter who had a terrible stuttering problem. In fact, the only way that he could speak, the only way that he could order his food was by pounding out his order. I want a cheeseburger. And as he did that, the salt and pepper shakers and the napkin dispenser and everything on the countertop was dancing. And my friend and I thought it was the funniest thing we'd ever seen. We began to mock that man, make fun of him on our way home. And since that time in my life, I've been a stutterer. I prayed to receive Christ when I was 12 years old. And my stutter did not end. It continued. School was terrible. Used to dread being called upon in class. Everyone knew I stuttered. My teachers knew I stuttered. My classmates knew I stuttered. But some teachers, a few, would call upon me anyway. Maybe, I don't know. I hope not, but maybe have a little fun. And it was a tough time. I remember one day, I just thought about this the other day. I remember one day my mother went to the school and let a teacher have it for embarrassing her son in front of the class. Because I would come home crying and upset. When I became a teenager, it got worse. It got a lot worse. I couldn't ask a girl out on a date like normal teenage boys do without being totally humiliated. There's enough anxiety in that already. You put stuttering on top of it and it gets nearly impossible. I couldn't order meals in a restaurant. I could, but it would just take too long. It just wasn't worth the effort. So I would write down on a piece of paper what I wanted to eat and give it to the server. It just took too long. Too many people just didn't have enough patience. And it was just easier for me and easier for them. And I just sort of learned to live my life that way. I couldn't answer the telephone. That's a hard thing for stutterers. Anything that's expected of you to say is difficult for a stutterer. For instance, when the telephone rings and you pick up the receiver, you say what? Hello. And you expect the person to say hello. But what if you can't get You know what happens? They hang up. So when you see that girl in high school and you want to ask her out on a date, and you call her up, and she picks up the phone and she says, hello? and you hear click. And then you wonder, what now? Should I pick up the phone and call again? Should I just draw a line through her name? What now? Answering a telephone is hard. One of the hardest things to say for a stutterer is your name. It's always one of the hardest things because, you're expected to know your name. If you don't know your name, something's wrong. But it's one of the hardest words to say. It was so hard for me to say. And stutterers oftentimes come up with ways to get around the block, or run and goes. Or that's why you hear sometimes people will say, Barry, to get the vocal cords loose. I was terrified at college. College was awful. Most of my teachers in elementary, middle, high school, most of them were good. But college, I went to a secular college, and they really didn't care. I went to business school, and they really didn't care. And I'm pretty sure that some of my college professors called upon me in class to answer a question or to give the answer for a homework assignment just because they wanted to have a little fun. And I would try to answer the question, and I would bite a hole in my tongue. Happened many times. And then your mouth begins to fill up with blood. And I run out of the room and go to the bathroom and spit into the sink and wet a paper towel and put a cold compress till the bleeding stopped. That's happened many times. I stuttered at my wedding. Tina, bless her heart. We sat down with the preacher. We saw that pastor in 2016, May of 2016. We sat down with him, and I said, Preacher, listen, you got to help me. I want to get married, but I can't say all that stuff. So fix it so that all I have to do is say, I do and I will, and I promise you right now, I'll do it and I will. And he said, okay. And sure enough, that's all I had to do was say, I do one time and I will one time. And I was legally married, and I couldn't do that. We've got the videotape. You know how you videotape your wedding? We've got the videotape to prove it. I couldn't do that. I had no self-confidence. A stutter may seem like a minor thing to those who've never experienced it. But I'm here to tell you, and there's others here that stutter, it's one of the most embarrassing and one of the most frustrating and humiliating things anyone can ever face. So I became an accountant. Because accountants can hide in back offices and stay away from the general public. It's one of those behind-the-scene kind of professions. Accounting is safe for stutterers. So you can imagine what was going through my mind when God began to deal with me, calling me to vocational ministry. For a long time, and as a matter of fact, for 2 years, I told God, God, you've got the wrong number and you know it. It's not funny. You know I can't do this. But if you've ever experienced, and I can't explain God's call. I can just tell you it's just relentless. It's a knowing. I knew what I was supposed to do, and I can't tell you any more than that. Except that I knew. There was no doubt. I knew what I had to do, but I couldn't do it. I also knew that, and it was relentless. It never went away. It was on my mind all the time. And I pushed it down. I tried to do other things for 2 years before I surrendered to go to seminary. And that's what I called it. My call was to, or God's call in my life was to attend seminary. That was it. Maybe that would satisfy God. And there was a local extension near our home. But that wasn't what God wanted us to do. And we moved away. We sold our house, everything we had, moved away to go to seminary. And in my mind, I was going to go and receive a seminary education and become an accountant in a church, be a church administrator in a larger church. That was what I was to do. When I entered seminary, I'd been there a year and a half or so. I began to experience that same call again. This time it was a call to preach. It was just as relentless, but it was just as clear. I knew what God was calling me to do, but I also knew that I couldn't do it. There was just no way. It was a physical impossibility. And I still am unable to preach. I don't know how God does this or speak, because there was a time in my life, and I know it's got to be difficult for you, but there was a time in my life to understand I couldn't speak. I just couldn't speak. I couldn't go up to the counter at McDonald's and order a hamburger meal like I can now and like you can. I couldn't. And I would avoid, and I'm an extrovert, and I would avoid people. I would avoid circumstances where I had to speak. And it was a difficult time there in seminary. I knew that God was calling me to preach, and I knew that I couldn't. And to get some peace in my life, I enrolled in a course called Sermon Preparation. If you've been to college, you know oftentimes there's 2-hour courses and 3-hour courses and 4-hour credit courses. This was a 4-hour course. It was a lot of work. It's really, it's like a Bible study course on steroids. It's a very in-depth, very intense Bible study course. Very difficult course. How to study the Bible in a way so that you can prepare a sermon. And at the end of the course, I went to my professor, Dr. Wayne McDeal, and I told him that I would not be taking sermon delivery, the second half of the course, a 2-hour course. And there were several of us, I remember the day, there were several of us gathered around where he was standing at the lectern, and I walked up and I just said, "Thank you, Dr. McDeal, great class. I appreciate what you've taught me. I will not be taking the second half of the course, sermon delivery." And he looked past everyone and he said, "Barry, be at my office." And he gave me a day and a time. And when Dr. McDeal told you to be somewhere, you were there. So I went at the appointed day, at the appointed time, knocked on the door, and he said, "Come in, Barry." And I walked in, opened up the door, and his chair the back of his chair was towards me. He was facing his computer. And he turned around, and I had a seat in a chair. He asked me to sit down. I sat down. And he began to talk to me. He began to ask about God's call on my life. He was interested in me. I told him that God had called me to teach stewardship education. And he told me how important, how valuable that he thought that was, how much of a need there was in the church for stewardship education. And we talked about that for some time, and not everybody was interested in stewardship. But he was. And then he asked me a question. He said, "Well, how do you plan to communicate stewardship education?" And I said, "Well, Dr. McDeal, I'm an accountant by trade, and I was trained to be an accountant. I want to learn to write. And then I want to write about it. Maybe one day do a PhD or some kind of a doctorate." And he said, "If you're going to be effective teaching stewardship, You're going to have to preach it. This is the church. And it was at that moment that somebody had to talk about the elephant in the room. Dr. McDill, you know that I can't speak. You know I stutter. I've been stuttering all the time I've been in your office. You know, how do you think I could preach? And what he told me next changed my life. It's one of those watershed moments in my life. You've had them too. Everything since that moment was different. And I'll never forget, he called me son. He says, son, you don't have a stuttering problem. He said, you got a problem, but it's not a stuttering problem. He said, you have a faith problem. And I'm just telling you, that blew me away. And he went on to lecture me. Somehow you think you have found the end of God. Somehow you think Barry Jimmerson has found the end of God, the limitations of God. God can't speak through Barry Jimmerson. You don't have a stuttering problem, you have a faith problem. And to make a long story short, he turned around and said, watch this, and he signed me up for the sermon delivery course right there in his office. And I preached my first sermon in front of a video camera, video recorder, my professor, and a handful of fellow students, and I did not stutter. I was perfectly fluent. And we were all amazed. And my professor was right. I didn't have a stuttering problem. I had a faith problem. This is my story. I had a faith problem. That was the crux of my problem, was faith. And I learned God can do anything. Anything He wants to do through any ordinary person who will faithfully submit their life to Him. God can do anything through any ordinary person who will faithfully submit their life to Him. Paul said, when I am weak, then I am strong. And God uses our weaknesses to demonstrate His strength. May rest upon me. Paul prayed 3 times for God to remove His thorn in the flesh. And God said, no, no, no. Instead, He told him, my grace is sufficient for you. My grace is all you need. For strength is made perfect in weakness. I used to beg God to remove my stutter from me. When I was a teenager, even in my late teens, 18, 19, 20 years old, would beg God to remove a stutter from me. I've cried myself to sleep many times, soaked my pillow through. Why? Please, God, let me just be normal. Let me just speak like everyone else. And God said no. And I began to realize that God was telling me, I've got you right where I want you. And when I began to realize that God had a purpose for this thorn in my flesh, for this stutter, I began to grow in my faith, and my whole attitude began to change. And there was a long time, when I begged God to remove this stutter from me. I was miserable. I was angry. And there was a long time that I begged God to remove this stutter from me. And now, all these years later, I praise His name for it. I'm thankful that I had that hardship because I realize I've been blessed. As a matter of fact, I probably have an unfair advantage over many of you. Because God made it really, really easy for me to depend upon Him because I knew I could not depend upon me. And every time I stand in the pulpit and preach every Sunday, not just this Sunday, but every Sunday, I've been preaching now 25 years. It blows me away. Because I can remember how impossible that is. And God wants the same victory for you.